Welcome, and to this tonight's Night Owls. What I'm going to say is not going to take long. I'm just here to frame tonight's iteration of Night Owls, and this is, of course, normally there is no framing, there's no introduction necessary to Agnes, and it's just because of today's event, or today's what surrounds the Night Owls, namely it marks and celebrates the launch of the Forum of Free Inquiry and Expression. I'm the faculty director of the college's Parousia Program for Public Discourse, and the Parousia program has provided institutional and financial support for Agnes Callard and her Night Owls debates from almost of the beginning. And these late night debates really exemplify how to listen, to understand, debate difficult, challenging, and controversial ideas and issues. They really practice what the Chicago principles preach. Again and again, Agnes shows us how to have spirited and passionate conversations with an open mind, boundless curiosity, generosity, and charity, and unflagging energy. Agnes has debated colleagues in philosophy, cinema and media studies, sociology, economists, and I could go on. Her husband, her ex-husband, about the philosophy of divorce, thinking philosophically about sex, and whether philosophy or economics is better to guide a valuable or rich life, the meaning of death, or do minds exist, to become a little bit more philosophical and dry. And she has been filling the rooms and lecture halls for almost 5 years, and when COVID forced us, everyone, to go online, we had almost 3,000 listen in. Which is to say that Agnes has been working up to tonight, where she has a really, really, really important guest, and which I'm not going to introduce because that's usually Agnes's prerogative, and she has already said to me that she's not going to do it either. And I don't really want to disrupt the process. So let me close by evoking an old MasterCard commercial. What Agnes does is priceless. For everything else, there is the Stracke Family Foundation, which has supported Night Owls from the very beginning. So welcome, everyone, and welcome, Agnes, and welcome our mystery guest.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Night Owls. So let me tell you how this is going to go. So Ross and I are going to talk for between 40 minutes and 55 minutes, depending on how much I indulge myself. And then we'll have a break. We'll go outside for cookies and milk or whatever we have to accompany the cookies. The break will be maybe 15 or 20 minutes long. And then we'll come back in here and you guys will ask us questions. Everyone who asks a question gets a t-shirt or a tote bag. So there'll be lines that form, okay? And you can leave whenever you want. This is not a class. You can also leave and come back, okay? We're not going to be offended. Okay, can I start by having you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I've been waiting for this moment for someone to ask me to introduce myself my whole life. How short? Let me be very short. I'm Ross. I'm Ross Douthat. I am an opinion columnist for the New York Times. I have been at the Times for 14 years, which is somewhat insane. And I guess that's probably most of what needs to be said. I've written a bunch of books. I am supposed to represent some form of conservatism, I think. I think we're going to be talking about tradition. So I'm probably a defender of some kind of idea of tradition, although whether that's actually a real description of what I am, we can probably tease out. I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut. I ended up living there again for complicated reasons involving, among other things, Lyme disease. I have 4 kids. I think they're all asleep, last time I checked. I write movie reviews for National Review. I don't know. Is that good?
That's great.
Okay.
That's the longest self-introduction any of my guests have
Are
ever
you
given.
serious?
I'm serious.
Oh my God, that's so, okay. So I'm starting off. All right.
Okay, so I spent today I read your book, The Decadent Society, and then I read like a bunch of your columns. And so I was like getting into, this is probably the most I'll ever be in your worldview. And I found it pretty depressing. And so let me read you a passage just to tell you what I find depressing.
Okay.
And then, so here's a quote from your book. The truth of America and the West in the first decades of the 21st century is that we have not been hurtling anywhere except maybe in a circle. Instead, we're aging, comfortable and stuck, cut off from the past and no longer optimistic about the future, spurning both memory and ambition while we await some saving innovation or revelation, burrowing into cocoons from which no chrysalis is likely to emerge, growing old unhappily together in the glowing light of tiny screens.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
rough. That's rough.
And so, do you think...
And that was pre-COVID, too, right? So...
Do you think that you have a bleaker outlook with respect to, say, the current human condition than the median person? And in a sense, by reading you, I'm entering into that, could be correct, right? But just a bleak point of view?
No, I think I'm very optimistic. I do. I mean, first of all, I'm sort of, you can't necessarily tell this by reading my sort of doom-laden analysis in that book, but I'm generally a fairly optimistic person in sort of personal life and engagement with the world. My expectations for sort of, what's likely to happen in the world around me. I have a certain degree of cosmic optimism, since I think that, the universe was created by a loving God who intends to redeem it in the fullness of time and whose victory is already assured over the forces of darkness, right? So that there's sort of immediate optimism and long-term optimism, and in between there's, I think, realism, right? I think that generally this is a fairly unhappy time in Western history. I think that is borne out in opinion polls and suicide rates and people claiming they aren't having children because of climate change, and a host of indicators that we could pile up. So I think saying the world around us seems a bit stuck and depressed and hopeless is neither optimistic nor pessimistic. It's just a description of where we actually are. And the broader argument in the Decadent Society is that you want to distinguish decadence from, active catastrophic collapse, right? Mm-hmm. And again, I was writing before we had, a global pandemic, arguable coup attempt. These things had happened after I finished writing the book. But I think the idea of decadence it's not catastrophe. It's stuckness. You're sort of stuck. Society doesn't know exactly where it's going. It doesn't have a vision of the future. But because it's not in a state of catastrophic collapse, there's the possibility that you could get to renewal, renaissance, revitalization without having to go through the literal fall of the Roman Empire. I have a lot of friends in conservative and reactionary circles who are way more pessimistic than I am. So maybe I overrate my own optimism relative to some of them. But I think the idea that, the Western world has sort of lost confidence in its own story, lost confidence in the future, and is looking for something, be it, a AI-style scientific breakthrough on the one hand, or some sort of religious revelation on the other hand, or through the mediation of psychedelic drugs, some sort of fusion of the technological and the spiritual. I think that's just a description of where we are now, and is not a sort of prophetic judgment on people who don't realize where they are. I think people realize where they are, and that's why people are a bit depressed. Maybe.
One thing I was surprised by your book is I thought of you as a conservative, but you care a lot about technological progress. Big chunks of your book are sort of lamenting the slowdown in sort of innovation, the fact that, between 1950 and 1970, there's a much bigger shift than between, say, 1970 and 1990, or between 1990 and today. Is it silly for me to be surprised by your kind of love of innovation and in some sense love of technology?
No, I think that that's a sort of weird feature of my outlook in a sense. I think when I sort of was a young fogey or a young reactionary 20 odd years ago, at the end of the 1990s when we just had the dot-com revolution and we just mapped the human genome and there was a lot of sort of hope and confidence about further major technological breakthroughs coming along, I kind of expected that I would just spend my career as a kind of Luddite, shaking my fist at the human-animal hybrids walking the streets around us, and there's an aspect of my personality that certainly tends that way, and I think there are aspects of technological change that are bad. I think the uses to which we've put our main technological achievement of the last 30 years, the internet, have been on balance bad for society and have contributed, I think they've contributed to sterility and stagnation in other ways. We sort of have a technologically mediated deepening of decadence. So I'm not just sort of a full spectrum, any technological innovation is going to be good for society. But I think in the path from young foginess to, critic of decadence or whatever you want to call my weird journey, I think I decided that basically the modern world, the developed world, is, it's not a traditional society. If you're in a traditional society, then you can make a defense just of sort of, in effect, of sort of stasis. You can say this is, we have some kind of organic relationship to the land and family and one another, and out of that, this is, Wendell Berry out on his farm or something. We're sort of defending this sort of particular way of life that's in harmony with nature. I mean, this is sort of an idealized portrait, but, there are societies in the modern world that match that. They're just, the Amish, right? I mean, they're there, but that's not the society that you and I live in. You and I live in a society that has been reshaped over and over again by technological progress and technological change, and I think has come, in effect, to sort of depend on dynamism for its energy and ambition, right? There is a sort of directional view of human affairs that is sort of inherited from Judaism and Christianity, but has obviously secularized forms that people sort of take for granted. And I don't think there's some clear alternative to that worldview. And I think, in fact, if you look at the history of, let's say, the last 200 years, and you say, well, is there sort of a clash between, let's say, traditional religion and modern technological progress? Well, yes, there are sort of particular flashpoints. Darwin's theory of evolution comes along, and all the Victorians have a crisis of faith. And, these sort of points of tension exist. But there's also a kind of creative interplay between these forces, where the 19th century is a high tide of sort of technological progress and industrialization and so on. And it's also a period of tremendous religious revitalization, right? It's new cathedrals are built as well as the Eiffel Tower, right? Church-going rates in Western Europe in many places go up between the early 1800s and the latter part of the 19th century. Or again, if you look at the period of sort of what I would say is sort of peak technological progress in modern America, which is the post-war era going up to the Apollo program. That is sort of the last high tide of American Protestantism. And in fact, you could argue that the Apollo project is the last achievement of American Protestantism in a peculiar way, which I'd be happy to defend after like 6 beers or something. But so I think that's, but I think you can go further back and look at sort of the Renaissance and the Reformation and scientific revolutions. Like, Western society has been defined by periods of technological ferment interacting with social, political, and religious forces that generate what we think back on as sort of traditional or conservative ways of life, but in fact are sort of successful reinventions of tradition. And so, as a conservative, I think Western society needs a reinvention of tradition in a very basic way, where we need to have more children and go to church more. Like, that's sort of the conventional conservative position. But part of me thinks for that to happen, that has to be interacting with dynamism in other areas of life, including technological dynamism, that if we were actually building a Mars colony, we might also be more likely to found monasteries on the red planet, hypothetically.
So are large language models, like ChatGPT, are those the good or the bad kind of technology? Like,
I don't know.
Okay. So
Do you know?
no.
I
so you
don't-
wrote about this, but
Yeah,
it was like maybe
I'm-
6 months ago.
Yeah, I guess a lot has happened in 6 months, but no, I think I have a sort of, the same things that make me think we've effectively misused the internet make me inclined to think that they could sort of deepen decadence in certain ways, that you can imagine a future where we spend a lot of time with AIs that we pretend are conscious, that aren't really conscious, that become our virtual friends and girlfriends and boyfriends. And there's sort of a dystopian trajectory that you can see pretty clearly. But then there's also the trajectory where the AI helps us, figure out protein folding in radical new ways that deliver cures for cancer, right? And I think it's, and it could deliver both, right? You can have some dystopia over here and some acceleration over here. But generally, my view is that technologies that enable us to do things that are transformative in physical reality are anti-decadent. And technologies that encourage us to go deeper into virtual realities are pro-decadence. And, maybe that's wrong. Maybe at a certain point, virtual reality becomes so amazing that we've built something even better than reality. And you can see in someone like Mark Andreessen has sort of this, he wrote this famous essay called A Time to Build, right at the start of the pandemic, where it was a strong statement of anti-decadence, basically saying, we are failing to handle COVID because we have failed to do things in the real world for a very long period of time, failed to build systems that work, failed to build structures of innovation, and so on. And then he came back later and sort of argued that I'm going to mischaracterize his argument slightly, but that actually things like the success of the vaccination push and so on showed that we had sort of built successfully in certain ways, but also that the virtual realm, the capacity of people to live in virtual realities was going to be this big transformation for the better, right? That I think the argument he made, right, was that historically medieval peasant or even American suburbanite can experience such a limited share of the world's riches, right? But through the magic of virtual reality, instant communication, all of these things, you are going to experience so much more of the world, so much more communication. You'll be able to, visit the pyramids of Giza virtually in a way that's indistinguishable from reality. And that's sort of, that's kind of the argument that at a certain point, virtual reality just becomes reality, improves on reality, and that's where it would be anti-decadent, right? But I think I don't agree with that. But that's the argument, that the pro-virtual reality anti-decadence argument, I guess.
But so when you talk about we haven't used the internet well, do you have a sense of what it would have been if we had used it well? What would we have done with it?
Well, less, right? Which is part of the problem, right? Yeah, which is maybe not a reasonable answer. But I don't have. I think I have specific ideas about what you would do. Well, put it this way: when I was a 23-year-old blogger, right, there was a very popular idea of what the internet was going to be, and it was going to be radical decentralization. It was going to be a widening of the apertures of debate. It was going to sort of, disempower central authorities and, create a sort of, essentially a more democratic political debate, a more small d democratic, a more democratic culture, and so on. And you can find some ways in which that has happened, right? Without the internet, no one would have, without the internet, Brooklyn socialism probably wouldn't have become as big a deal as it was, and no one would have ever heard of Bronze Age pervert, right? So you can't deny that in some ways the internet has widened the apertures of debate. But for most people, the internet has, I think, sort of increased a certain kind of centralization and, in certain ways, conformism, right? Where, something like, there was this book called The Long Tail that came out, sort of, I forget exactly when it came out, but it was during the period when people were still more optimistic about the internet, right? And the argument in this book was the internet was going to, it used to be that you'd write a book that only 50 people read and it would disappear and no one would ever read it again, and you wouldn't make any money from it, and so you'd never write another book. But now, in the age of everything being available online, that book would find this small but steady readership, right? That would sort of circulate its ideas and support the work that went into writing the book and enable this to happen sort of at a large scale. You have tons and tons of people, writing for sort of niche audiences, but being able to support themselves and being able to sort of do creative work in this way. And again, there are places where you can still see that on the internet. You could say that's what Substack is, right, in certain ways. But the broader effect of the internet has been instead to funnel people towards, it seems like, a narrower range of things, right? So you have fewer mid-sized bands and only one Taylor Swift, right? Nothing against Taylor Swift, but it's striking, like the degree to which she bestrides American musical culture would not have been predicted by people looking at the internet in 2003. Or, even something like Wikipedia, right? Wikipedia is a marvel of sort of internet culture, but it's also a sort of centralized repository of knowledge. It's not a decentralized repository. There's only one Wikipedia. There aren't 6 rival Wikipedias. I know there's Conservapedia, and there are Wikipedia, there are other pedias, but even as a kid sitting with my parents' bookshelf and picking up like some random history books, the Encyclopedia Britannica and the Columbia Encyclopedia, I got a more diverse range of takes than you would get looking at Wikipedia, even though Wikipedia obviously, gives you the details of, the Teutonic Knights campaign in Lithuania and so on that wouldn't have been in the Encyclopedia Britannica probably. But I think there's a lot of that. And I think maybe I'm biased here because I work in professional journalism, and professional journalism is sort of the core example of how this worked, right? When the internet came along, every American city had its own daily newspaper, and often it had a daily newspaper and tabloid. When I was a kid, there were still afternoon newspapers, so that was a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And the internet destroyed all of that. And it didn't, it did so in ways that, again, were sort of hard to imagine how it would have been prevented. Craigslist coming along and destroying the classified section that sort of paid the salaries of every reporter at the Baltimore Sun, where my wife worked for a while. I don't think there's sort of a way that wouldn't have happened. But because it happened, there are now only 3 newspapers in America that are sort of thriving concerns, and one of them is owned by one of the richest men in the world and is losing tons of money at the moment, the Washington Post, right? So I'm incredibly lucky to work at a newspaper that sort of come through the internet funnel, but journalism has become much, much more centralized as a result of the internet. Anyway, I'm rambling without answering your question of how it would have gone differently. I don't know exactly how it would have gone differently. I don't think it was sort of a volitional thing. I do think there were some decisions like, let's give second graders Chromebooks that look moronic in hindsight and looked pretty moronic at the time. Mostly stuff with kids. I think we should have been able to do better. But a lot of the changes, it's a new technology. You just have to figure out what it's going to do and react.
So I've been thinking about, you think we live in a pretty unhappy time. And I'm thinking you're maybe comparing this time to like the time you would have expected that you would be living in now 10 years ago or something like that. That is, so I sort of see you as like a historian of the recent past, the present, and the shortly upcoming future. Reading your stuff, it seemed to me like a lot of the time, so you teach me a lot about like what is happening now, what happened in the past 20 years.
Take it with a grain of salt.
And then it's not like you like to predict things, like what's going to happen next. You do so in a very epistemically humble way where you're like, here's a couple different possibilities or whatever. So it's not like you're like, this is what's going to happen. But you're very interested in this question, what is going to happen next?
Mm-hmm. Aren't you?
No,
okay.
Definitely not as much as
Why
you
not?
are. I'm more interested in the question, what should happen next, I guess. I want to separate. I've sort of my question moved from one thing to another. So let me just flag. I'm going to go back to the first question about whether we're living in an unhappy time. But maybe let me ask you about this kind of prediction thing that you do. So is it just like you're interested in what's going to happen next, and so you want to know it in some way before it actually happens? And so you are creating models of here are some things that might happen. That's the idea? Or can you tell me more about why you want to predict what happens next?
Well, one, I'm very bad at predicting what happens next, right? Mm-hmm. Which is one reason that my epistemic humility is mostly just like I'm bad at predictions. I've gotten a lot of things wrong, as readers of the New York Times would be happy to tell you. And so I've sort of learned from that experience, and so when I write about the future now, I try and I'm always offering multiple scenarios, right?
Absolutely.
And it's very kind of you to call me a historian, but fundamentally I'm a newspaper columnist. And the truth about being a newspaper columnist is that people want you to tell them what is going to happen next. Like that is what the job is, in a way that is actual newspaper. We aren't actually good at this, right? But for some reason, that's sort of the expectation. Like and usually it's just about politics, right? But if I, go to a family reunion or a dinner party or something with people who I see occasionally, the 100% guarantee is that at some point somebody is going to say, take me aside and say, okay, but Ross, what do you really think is going to happen in 2024, right?
So they think you are an expert of that. Of knowing what's going to
with
happen.
Politics especially, yeah, more so than other areas. And I say, well, if you read my columns, I have like 4 scenarios of what can happen. But they're like, but what do you really think, right? There's always a sense that like the pundit is sort of holding out on you if he or she offers multiple scenarios. So part of it is just like the job description, right? Like newspaper columnists offer predictions the way plumbers fix toilets. Like that's just in the contract, right? But part of it is that, the world, this is sort of a shift, right? Like it's a shift sort of since I started writing about decadence, right? Is that the world has become more unstable. And in a way, my sort of decadence diagnosis came, 5 to 7 years too late, right? Speaking of, pundits being late, right? Part of what I was describing in that book was sort of the mood of like the Obama-Romney presidential election, right? Where it's like you're just sort of, it's just sort of center right and center left trading punches, and all sort of interesting ideological stakes seem drained out of the world. And that doesn't feel like the world we live in now, right? The world we live in now has delivered a lot of substantially interesting and unexpected events, starting from my perspective with the thing that set it all in motion, which was Pope Benedict resigning, right? Disturbance in the space-time continuum wrenched us into an unexpected timeline. See, everyone laughs, but it's totally true. And, Trump, Brexit, we had a plague. We're, inventing artificial intelligence. UFO visitations are being, discussed by the Pentagon, right? Like this has become, in the last 5 to 10 years, a more interesting timeline, I think, than it was before, a more frightening timeline in certain ways. A lot of people are very unhappy with it, so there's sort of an interest, I think a natural interest in, well, what further changes might come? Will they make people even more unhappy? Will people become happier? And then, I don't know, yeah, I think I've become, when I started writing about decadence, I guess, I thought to my thinking was, we're in this sort of period of stasis and gridlock and decay, and so it's interesting to think of what might snap us out of it on the expectation that that snapping out might not happen in my lifetime. That was sort of where I was when I started writing the book. That was 2017 or so. Actually, technically, I started working on it in 2014, and then I got sick and had to write a book about the Pope, which was a big mistake. But it's available on Amazon.com and holds up very well, so buy it. But here in 2023, I think it's more like, what's next, right? I mean, I think it would be weird. Like, I find there's a certain style of thinking that sort of ho-hums weirdness, right? Like it's pretty weird that there's apparently a bunch of people in the Pentagon who think that we're being buzzed by aliens. Not saying we're being buzzed by aliens. I'm saying it is interesting, inherently interesting to me, that we know more. We know now that a larger group of Pentagon officials or deep state functionaries or whatever than I would have predicted think that, aliens, or maybe they're interdimensional travelers, maybe they're demons, who knows? They think that this is like a real thing. So what's going to come of that? Are we just going to sit here for the next 50 years being like, kind of curious that, a bunch of people in our national security establishment believe in aliens or demons? Maybe. But I personally kind of think there may be another twist coming, and I'm interested in that. It's interesting, right? So I don't know. I mean, the world's interesting, right? And what happens next is, it's something about the world that you don't know that you will find out about without having to get a PhD, conduct any chemistry experiments. I mean, it's going to be given to us no matter what. And maybe that's a case for being less curious about it, because it's going to happen no matter what. But again, I have to write 3 columns a week, so the future is fertile territory.
So I happen to be reading right now this series of French novels by Émile Zola. It's called the Rougon-Macquart series. It's 20 novels about sort of...
people could write.
Here
I am like, 3 columns a week. Zola is like...
Yeah, Zola's insane.
Like,
it was like a novel a year. Yeah. And what he's doing in these novels is he is giving you snapshots of different parts of French society. The one I'm reading right now is about peasants. And so when you tell me, like, we live in a pretty unhappy time, I'm, like, comparing it to what I'm reading in Zola, and, like, they're pretty unhappy. They're starving. They don't want kids. Sometimes they sometimes have kids, but they generally are unhappy about the birth of kids very often. They're really mean to their kids. The kids and the parents often hate each other. They are often in an adversarial relationship. There's not that much literacy. There's not that much food, but it's not just the lower, just the peasants. I mean, I now have read novels for a bunch of different parts of the society. There's just a lot of unhappiness. It could be that Zola was focusing on it, and in fact, he was sort of accused of that a bit, of being misanthropic and focusing on the negative. But it's like, I've never lived in any other time than the time that I'm living in, but if I try to construct the world of, the world of the time that Zola lived in France, I would just find it very hard to confidently say that we live at a less happy time than that time.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't make the specific claim that the average person in the United States is less happy than a French peasant in 1842.
The French upper classes were also super unhappy.
I think it would be very tough. I think that kind of intratemporal analysis it's a little bit tough. Like, what are we talking about exactly when we talk about happiness? I'm most comfortable saying I think Americans are unhappier now than they were in the 1990s, which I was around for, and other parts of the later 20th century, which I feel like I have strong cultural access to as a child of baby boomers, sort of able to watch movies from the 1950s and so on. I think there's but even sort of, there are also different kinds of unhappiness, right? And, this is not an original observation to say that modernity sort of solves a bunch of problems of basic subsistence and that are sort of fundamental drivers of deep tragedy and unhappiness for most of human history, but generate sort of new and somewhat different problems of sort of existential meaning and so on that seem to beset people. And there is, I'm going to throw French novels back at you. I tried to read Les Miserables a few years ago because my kids got really, really into the soundtrack to the Broadway show, and we listened to it over and over again. And I was like, maybe I should actually read this novel. And I did not finish the novel because my attention span has been destroyed by the iPhone, and it is 1,217 pages long, and I made it 650 pages in. But I'm still going to say something about it, right? Which is that Hugo has this insane confidence in that book that he, and 19th century France and the modern world, but he, right, is figuring things out and making things better. And it's he's okay, tell story, people die, Javert, Valjean, and so on. Pause. We're going to do 50 pages on exactly which parts of Catholicism we need to keep and which parts we need to get rid of in order to achieve the better future.
Yeah.
Right? And that, and that energy I think is recognizable in a lot of 19th century literature. And even whether it's Zola or, Dickens and so on, the people who are doing the kind of muckraking and sort of showing you the pity and horror of, poverty and suffering, they too have a bunch of that spirit, right? And, if you read novels nowadays, around the same time I was trying to read that book, I was trying to read the latest Sally Rooney novel. And the Sally Rooney novel is it's I've got this peach here. Am I gonna eat the peach? Maybe I'll masturbate while I think about whether to eat the peach. And in the latest one, it's well, we're gonna go to church. It sure is interesting to go to church. There are some people here who believe in God. It'd be nice to believe in God. We can't believe in God, that's too weird. And I'm sorry, but there's something going on in Hugo that's not going on in Rooney that is worthwhile and that we've lost. And it's okay to say, we don't want to go back to the grinding poverty of Germinal or whatever Zola novel, which I haven't read, but I can name check it. But also say, there also has to be something besides this sort of hysterical paralysis that informs at least some aspects. I'm generalizing, right? But some aspects of life in a world where, the fertility rate is 1.4, and people are doom scrolling all the time. And, again, this is these are just things that, being a pessimist, I like to bring up. But I'm not a pessimist, so.
Let me talk about the fertility thing. So, you talk about the book and the movie Children of Men, and there's a philosopher, Sam Scheffler, who has written about this kind of what he sees as kind of a puzzle, and I see it as a little bit of a puzzle too, which is just that the thought of the end of humanity through infertility fills us with a kind of horror that is hard to understand. At least for me, it's a little bit hard to understand. That is like, so imagine, right? Like, you know, the youngest people you know are the last generation of human beings. And they're gonna live like good lives like yours, right? I mean, there's not gonna be any terrible disease that will wipe them out or whatever. They won't have kids, right? And then that's gonna be it. The thought of that, it just fills me with a kind of panic. And I take it fills you with panic too. That is, you think of that as just an extreme nightmare scenario, much more than the thought of like one's own death, right? You could think, I'm gonna die, that's fine, but humanity is gonna die? Somehow, it feels like life is sapped of its meaning when you imagine that scenario. So, I mean, first ask you, do you agree? Does it fill you with panic or horror, that scenario?
Not exactly. I mean, I think in the Children of Men scenario, which is the P.D. James novel where, you know, in the mid-1990s in her timeline, all the men in the world wake up one day and are infertile, right? And sort of, in that scenario, it's clearly a judgment by a righteous God on the decadence of modern civilization. And so it makes me sad that we sucked so much that God decided to curse all our men with infertility. But it doesn't fill me with horror. The prospect of what is actually happening in the world where it's not like the human race is going to go on, but sort of the richest societies on Earth are filled with people sort of semi-voluntarily, we can argue about how voluntary it actually is, deciding not to reproduce. That's depressing. I don't think it's horrifying. So, yeah, I think horror. Yeah, I don't think horror is my emotion. I think it's lamentable and weird for like it's sad. Like South Korea has a fertility rate of 0.8. So for every 2 South Koreans, there will be 0.8 South Koreans in 50 years' time. I'm not like a huge South Korea file, but I like South Korea. I like that it exists. I would prefer for it to continue to exist. I wish it had more. I wish South Koreans had more children. Again, horror isn't exactly the thing, and there is also something. The part of me that is curious about the future is interested in, what happens when, Western Europe has 700 million people and Africa has 5 billion people. That will be interesting, right? May not yield happy outcomes, but even that is not horror. It's more sadness. Like I am a white northeastern United States descendant of people from the British Isles, so I have a sort of particularist attachment to, Western European culture, right? And so it's sad to me as a descendant of Western Europeans that this civilization seems to have fallen into a decadence so deep that it can't sustain itself. But sadness rather than horror, I think.
I mean, I guess in the James novel, and this also comes through in the movie, though in a slightly different way, there is this conceit that it really is the knowledge of there being no more humans in the future that throws people into a very, very profound kind of decadence. And the ultra millennials, as you call them, the omegas or whatever, they're like the worst off. And I suppose
after Generation Z comes the omegas. Yeah. No offense to any omegas.
I take it that the sort of James's claim there, and I would say it's an insight, is that for many of us anyway, it would just feel horrifying to know that there weren't going to be any humans in the future. It would feel like if it's sad if there are fewer of them, it's way worse there are none of them. But if you think of it as, like in the novel, a judgment by a righteous God, why couldn't you also see our scenario as like a judgment by a righteous God? Like God just decided to have us have lower fertility because we're so decadent, and then that could be a good thing because we're getting what we deserve.
I mean, I think you do partially have to see it that way. I mean, I think maybe not any religious person, but a Christian has to see at least the outlines of the workings of providence, divine providence in history. And again, you don't want to be presumptuous and sort of overread into anything, but you have to assume that God allows things to happen for some reason that is not simply arbitrary and capricious. So, you know, the decline, forget fertility rates, like the various crises that have beset, you know, my own religious tradition, Christianity, Roman Catholicism, and so on. Like, you can't just take those, as a Christian, you can't just take those as sort of random facts that are, you know, sort of lamentable, but not sort of fraught with meaning and significance, right? Like, you know, if you're a Catholic and you say, you know, why is Catholicism in decline in the United States? Well, you know, the protection of predatory priests by the Catholic hierarchy for many decades. You know, is it it's God's judgment on? I mean, if you read the Old Testament, right, God chose the Jews, loved the Jews, and smote the Jews constantly, right? And that's sort of, I think that's sort of built in to at least the Judeo-Christian style of religious belief, that you have to assume that sometimes there's going to be, smiting is one way of putting it, but another way is saying, maybe to your point, that God sort of abandons you to your own sins to some extent. And you can get out of that abandonment by turning back to God, but that abandonment has consequences for what happens to you yourself. It fits your own life, but society as a whole as well.
I want to ask you about persuasion. So recently there was a New Yorker profile of you that talked about, you said something like, do people have a theory of persuasion? Maybe they even called it something about your theory of persuasion, but you don't actually say anywhere in it what your theory of persuasion is. So do you have
I didn't read the piece, but
I understand.
I imagine that you are the one person in this room who does understand. But
do you have a theory of persuasion, and maybe like, or you could even start with what is persuasion?
Yeah, I think they took the title. I had a conversation with the writer in which I think I said something about contemporary liberals lacking a theory of persuasion, probably in the context of RFK Jr. and sort of debates about vaccine skepticism. And I think that's true. I think, at least for a slice of contemporary liberalism, there is this sense that certain forms of sort of disagreement are problems to be solved through effectively sort of regulatory hygiene rather than argument. And this is behind a lot of sort of the theory that you can combat misinformation or disinformation in these particular ways that aren't really about argument. They're about sort of clever, sort of censorious technological solutions to people being wrong on the internet. I think that's a problem for liberalism in particular, because I think the liberal theory of how society is supposed to work is sort of particularly invested in the idea of sort of argument, debate, and persuasion. So that's probably where all that came from. But yeah, I mean, I write columns for people who mostly disagree with me. That's an exaggeration, but more than many newspaper columnists, I write for people who disagree with me. And so I don't have a theory of persuasion, but I have sort of maybe multiple theories, or maybe I only have one theory. I mean, I think argument has to proceed generally from trying to establish some kind of sort of common ground or common shared premise or shared starting place. And sometimes you can find one, and sometimes you have to try and create one. So I write, these are all shticks, right? As a columnist, you have crutches that you use and shticks that you fall into, but there's probably a shtick of column writing that I have where I say, here's something that I think liberalism gets right, or here's something that I think, here's some sort of statements that you, liberal New York Times reader, are likely to agree with. And then I sort of try and work from that step by step to some conclusion that is totally shocking and outrageous to the readership, and hope that I have pulled some small percentage of people along, right? But then alternatively, there's sort of the reframing, right? Where you say, here's some historical story that you, the reader, has, and here's why it's mistaken. And once you recognize why it's mistaken, or maybe just more complicated than you thought, then maybe you're open to this sort of novel interpretation. But I don't know if any of that adds up to sort of a sort of pure theoretical structure. I'm sure that there's sort of, some of it is just sort of arts of rhetoric that, you're sort of trying to reinvent in a crude 1,000 words in a newspaper style.
So one way for me to hear what you just said is that it's kind of an empirical claim that the group of people who you describe as not having their persuasion, liberals, that they have a certain theory about how you get people to believe something, and it involves, let's say, partly like not talking to certain figures, not giving attention to so like pulling attention away. And you have a different theory, which is that you should like try to win the argument with that person. And
up to a point. I mean, I think the theory of exclusion can work in certain contexts, right? But once it breaks down, you can't just sort of do it harder, right? Like there are sort of moments, obviously, like there are ideas that we don't debate in normal American political discourse, and what those ideas are shift from era to era and moment to moment. But, the New York Times is not going to run an opinion piece defending, Jim Crow or segregation, and nor should it, right? Like this is sort of a settled moral issue, that the fact that there are still some people in America who believe in segregation doesn't mean that liberals need to preemptively unsettle it for the sake of debate. But if it's 1937 in the United States of America, and you are trying to win the argument over civil rights, you have to be willing to argue with people who believe in segregation. I think the challenge this isn't just true of liberals, obviously, but it's sort of maybe true of liberals at this particular moment, is there's a sense that things that people told themselves were settled seem to become unsettled, right? And it's like, well, why can't we go back to having them be settled again? That's sort of, like you could see this with vaccinations, right? Like sort of anti-vaccine sentiment has arguably become a lot more influential in the last 10 or 15 years, and certainly sort of accelerated by COVID-era debates. It's become more unsettled. As it becomes more unsettled, the obligation to actually try and win the argument increases, and your capacity to just sort of create a cordon sanitaire decreases, right? But it's understandable to sort of feel upset that you have to do that. It's like, well, why do I have to argue with RFK Jr.? It's ridiculous, right? So, although even that's sort of an overstatement, because the reality is that 20 years ago, there was a lot more sort of anti-vaccine sentiment among liberals themselves, which is why you can go back and watch RFK Jr. getting respectful attention for his critiques of Big Pharma from like Jon Stewart and people like that. So it isn't even that the sort of from unsettled to settled, or from settled to unsettled story is almost too flattering to liberals, but it's certainly what people feel with a lot of things. It's like, why are we having this debate again? We shouldn't have to have it.
But the thing I wanted to ask about was whether this is just an empirical claim about what it takes to bring about people having the view that you want them to have, and you have a dispute with this group where they think, look, it's more useful a lot of the time to like pretend that people aren't saying things, and you think, no, it's more useful to like talk to them. If you thought you could bring about your results by ignoring people, you would do that. It's just you think, that's less likely to work. And then you might think it's going to be, let's say, like you talk about sort of the wokeism becoming entrenched, at least in certain institutions. It may well turn out to be the case that actually the like ignore and silence strategy has like some success to it. And then you'd be fine with using that strategy because your goal is just to achieve the same result? Or is it that you actually think it's important to argue with people? Not because that's a way to bring about the beliefs that you want, but for some other reason.
I'm not sure. I think it honestly sort of varies from situation to situation and issue to issue. Like there's definitely, I don't, like, would you, let's say you have a belief that you consider is absolutely true and certain, and 100% of people agree with you on this belief. I would not say that you have an obligation to, like, rear up a child to hold the contrary belief, right, in order to have someone to argue with, right? Like if it's good for people to believe true things. So if everyone believes a true thing, then, or if 99% of people believe a true thing, right, 99.99%, then if you are, well, I guess it depends, right? Let's say you have a close friend who's a flat earther. Is there value in arguing with that friend about their theory? Yes, out of a spirit of friendship. You want that friend to believe the truth about the world, which is not that we live inside a huge wall of ice surrounding the entire planet that we mistakenly think is Antarctica. Anyway, the actual geography of flat Earth theories is kind of fascinating. See, but now I've been sucked in. But yeah, I mean, I think we see through a glass darkly. You sort of have to assume that human knowledge is provisional and human certainties are provisional, and this creates a certain value to argument. And you want to live, I mean, I don't want to live in a society sort of run by a ministry of truth or something, even if that ministry of truth had the truth on its side, because human beings are fallible and corrupt, and even if you have, 100% of the truth on your side, you're likely to abuse your power in defense of the truth. But I don't know that it's sort of, argument is sort of a necessary thing, and it's a necessary part. A society without arguments in the world in which we live is not a free society. But I don't know if that means that, I don't have a certain answer, I guess, right? I think if you can know the truth, just sort of continuing the argument endlessly is not a good unto itself.
If you know
Right.
the truth, I think you can teach it. That would be the good thing to do.
That would be, yes.
But you wouldn't be bothered by people who disagreed with you because you know it. You have a proof, right? You're good. But I guess I define persuasion as unilateral cognitive determination. So if I'm persuading you of something, then I'm trying to bring it about, like I'm talking to you, but the goal, the end result is supposed to be that you come into line with me. That's the correct direction of fit. And so that's my theory of persuasion. So I think persuasion's a bad thing generally. Like you shouldn't try to persuade people of things, because if you know something, you should teach it. So you don't need to do persuasion. And if you don't know it.
What's the difference between teaching and persuasion?
So I think that
Teaching assumes people who don't know the truth, but also don't have a pre-existing false belief.
Oh no,
right?
often you have to teach things to people who have false beliefs. Teaching means you have a proof. And so, like, if you actually have like the proof that the Earth is round, which I don't have, but if you had it, you could explain that, and then the person who you explained it to would understand it. But most of us actually don't know what the proof is, and so we feel a little awkward because we feel pretty sure the Earth is round, but that's the situation we're actually in. I guess I think that insofar as persuasion is just an alternative to using like the silencing methods, it's just like another way to bring about the people agree with you, then it's very different from teaching. Because in the case of
the silencing method, so the theory of the silencing method is effectively like a quarantine, right? So let's say that all of you in the front row believe the Earth is flat, and we don't want anyone else in this room to think the Earth is flat,
right?
Because we're concealing that truth. No, because we know the truth that the world is round. So the silencing method is no one in this row is allowed to talk,
Right.
on the internet. And if they do talk on the internet, we're going to put this is misinformation, right? It's going to be
Right. Yes.
It's like memes getting loose, right?
Right.
And that's quite different from like the point of persuasion would be to let the flat earthers in the front row make their case and come figure out what is the evidence, right, that the earth is round, and offer that evidence. And I think the reasonable goal in that scenario is, yes, there's sort of two things are happening. One is there's just sort of this is just sort of, the theory is like, the cordon sanitaire doesn't work. You can't just make them shut up. Your stickers on them just make other people more interested in what they have to say, because you and I, the deep state, we can't be trusted, right? So it's not going to work. So it's just a pragmatic choice. Like, we are pragmatically saying we're going to persuade, but we also want. So persuasion is a way to keep their ideas from reaching too many. Like, you're arguing with them in order to convince other people not to join them, right? That's one layer. But then the hope is also that you, out of the rest of the flat earthers, might be convinced. We're not going to convince them all, right? Persuasion is limited, but we might convince one of them, and then we've expanded the number of people who know the truth and believe it, right? So I think there's a model that is not. There is a sort of like, we're just doing this instrumentally to sort of prevent the bad ideas from getting out because the other method doesn't work. But there's also a way in which you have the deluded person's good in mind, and you can't reach all. I mean, look, as a newspaper columnist, like, I'm under no illusions that most people who read my columns come away with their minds changed. But you have to hope that some person reading your column is moved in some direction slightly towards the truth as you, the writer, sees it, and that over time, over hundreds and thousands of columns, you have moved some insignificant, but, in the economy of the kingdom of heaven, real share of people towards the truth. And I don't think you're like sort of kidnapping them and dragging them into your cult when you do that. I think that you are trying to open people's minds to realities that, for whatever reason, you are aware of, and they, unfortunately, because they live in a decadent society, have not yet been exposed to.
Do you think that the things you're trying to get people to believe, that they're all things that you actually know and have a proof of? Or are they just things that you strongly believe?
Well, what counts as a proof?
A demonstration that any reasonable listener, if I wanted to explain to you, how do you find the double square? If you've got one square and you want a second square that's twice as big as the first square, how are you going to draw that second square? Mm-hmm. And I'm going to tell you the answer is you can draw it off the diagonal of the first square. And I could give you a proof of that because I actually know it. And I would, in that process, I would be wanting you. I wouldn't want you to come to believe that the double square comes from the diagonal. That would not be my goal. My goal would be for you to understand why that's true.
Right.
I wouldn't want you to believe it until you understood why it was true.
Yeah. No, that's right. And that's mostly not what I'm doing. I guess not just me, but anyone engaged in professional persuasion business in sort of issues related to politics or morality or anything else is assuming that they have a view for which the evidence that it's true is stronger than their reader or listener realizes. And you are trying to essentially get people to acknowledge that the evidence for your contention is not the equivalent of a mathematical proof, but is stronger and therefore more likely to be sort of direct, pushing in the direction of actual truth than than your reader or listener realized before they read or heard what you had to say. Now, there's sort of a zone of, issues that are maybe closer to a mathematical proof where, you get into this with, sort of the realm of sort of political science and economics and so on. It's like, you have a debate about the minimum wage, right? And there are certainly people who think that there is a definite answer to the question of, is the minimum wage good or bad, that is close to your mathematical example, where someone could just recognize the math and be like, yes, why was I ever so foolish as to support the minimum wage? But I personally, I don't think those even those kind of examples reach the level that you're talking about, for a host of reasons. So even with sort of questions of economic reality, such as it is, you're still sort of dealing in the preponderance of evidence for this perspective on a minimum wage. I want you to know that it's stronger than you thought before you read my column. I think that's what you're doing.
Let me ask one last question because I've gone over my time. But I want to ask you about conservatism and whether there's something inherently anti-intellectual about conservatism. So here's why you might think that's the case. It seems to me that conservatism is characterized by a view that there's a lot of implicit knowledge in the world that we can't quite articulate or bring. We're not necessarily fully aware of, and so if we try to change things or improve things, we're often not reckoning with these maybe unspeakable or inarticulate forms of knowledge. Chesterton's fence is the perfect example of sort of a way of stating conservatism that is along these lines, and so thinking that no matter how much thinking you do, there's just still a bunch of implicit wisdom in the way that things are done that can't be sort of reckoned with and then added up with a bunch of considerations for why we should change things. That seems to me to be, in a certain way, anti-intellectual. And I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I think as a generalization, I think there's some truth to that. I think that politics on the right becomes more attractive to intellectuals during periods of crisis when it's clear that Chesterton's fence has already fallen down. And so there's sort of an exciting opportunity to figure out, one, now that it's fallen down, now we can see what it was doing, right? We couldn't see before, but now we can see. And two, there's an exciting opportunity to figure out how we build a new fence, right? And so I don't think it's a coincidence that there's sort of, there was more among university students in the early 20th century. There was a lot more, let's sort of put bluntly, more support for fascism than there would be sort of support for American conservatism in the 1970s, because fascism presented itself as a sort of as reactionary futurism, right? The old order has been destroyed by the evil liberals and the even more evil communists, and now we're going to build a new world, a new era that draws on some form of ancient tradition, but is also sort of constructing something new. I think that's more attractive to intellectuals than the conservatism of obviously he had intellectual supporters, but even a Ronald Reagan, right? Ronald Reagan is basically saying, America's in good shape. People are good. Like Republicans, Mike Pence still says this, right? Which is why no intellectuals like Mike Pence. The intellectuals on the right, nobody likes Mike Pence, right? But there's conservatism tends to say things are good to the extent they're bad. It's the liberal elites and the intelligentsia messing it up, and we need to sort of stop them and let the fundamental goodness of society reassert itself. But at certain points in history, conservatives cease to believe that there is this sort of fundament still there, right? And I think we're definitely in such a moment for like younger conservatives now. And at that point, that's where conservatism becomes reaction. And reaction isn't a pejorative, it's just a normative description. You can be a conservative who thinks things are basically okay and we don't want to tear down the fence, or you can be a reactionary who's like, we tore down that fence, what the hell, right? And we're in a what the hell moment on the right now, and that's, again, I think more attractive to would-be intellectuals than is a sort of like Tory disposition of avoiding too much hasty change. That's a theory, at least.
Well, actually, one last
Yeah.
thing. So
Yeah.
I've heard.
They're
I've
trapped.
Heard,
They
I've heard
can't.
it,
You told them they could leave, but there's an arm.
it is actually hard to leave.
Yeah.
That's true. I've heard it said, I can't remember now by who, on Twitter or something, that conservatives.
X. You mean on X?
I'm just going with Twitter. No one can actually make me stop saying Twitter, is what I learned. That conservatives in general just care less about politics and political ideology than progressives. They're just less invested in it. They're less passionate about it. They're consuming less political news,
They
etc.
just want to grill.
Yeah, basically. So is this true?
Wait, what?
So is
I'm not
this
sure
true?
what
Some
we're
people,
cheering for, but
I think
I do grill.
some people think it's true. Is it true? And then if it's true, is this like about to change? Or I have to ask you a question about what's going to happen in the future. I guess I've learned that that's what I'm supposed to ask you. So, yeah.
Oh, I don't know what's going to happen in the future at all. Yeah, I mean, I think there's good reason to think that at least some segment of American conservatives are more invested in private life than public life and public political debate relative to liberals. I think where that is, I think that changes a bit, though. Well, I think this is a case where the internet changes things a bit, right? Because the internet gives you opportunities to sort of do virtual politics that, is maybe compatible with going out and grilling, right? Mm-hmm. As the Republican Party's voter base becomes more and more composed of retirees, like they like to grill, but they have a lot more free time on their hands, right? I mean, I think what tends to happen with there's sort of a cliche that captures some reality that the sort of median or modal or whatever Republican voter has more kids than the typical Democratic voter, is sort of consumed with the kids, is more likely to be church-going and involved in that. All of these things are sort of sources of meaning and action that are, that sort of pull you away from politics, maybe. But I don't know, it's a big country. There's lots of conservatives who spend a lot of time thinking about politics, right? So, there's something to that, but I don't think you can build too much of a sort of philosophy of the world out of it, right? It's certainly true that contemporary progressivism, in certain ways, maybe channels religious energy into politics in a more overt way than some aspects of conservatism. But then, then you look at sort of Trump-era conservatism and you're like, man, there's a lot of religious energy being channeled into politics on the right too. So I don't know how huge that difference is between liberals and conservatives right now.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to take a break. So we're going to go out there and have cookies. And you can't bring any food back in here. So eat your cookies out in the outer area. And then I'll come back in 15 seconds. Ross, I'm going to ask you to try to give as fast answers as you can so we can get through as many questions as possible. Because look how many...
I'm sorry, yeah.
Look how many people we've got here. Okay, let's start right over here.
Hello? Yes.
now.
Okay, thank you. So I first want to thank you again for coming and holding this discussion. In the reactionary circles, like folks like Patrick Deneen have mentioned, classical liberalism is the question I think that a lot of people in the reactionary circles that you've mentioned, especially in conservatism, are questioning now. Is it possible with a society that is increasingly not believing in God? And many people might say that classical liberalism was only capable when we did believe in God, but it's been replaced by technologies, other idols. Reason is one of them. So my question is, does classical liberalism still work, and can we rely on this normative framework to fix the decadence that you have identified? And is this more of a political movement or a spiritual one, I guess?
Short answers, right?
Yes.
Short answers are, so I think what liberalism is a really uncertain question. I mean, my basic view of the American system is that that sort of our constitutional, you can basically define liberalism as sort of a light touch structure that allows for conflict between thicker, richer worldviews, and therefore, in the optimistic scenario, right, basically, is that American society was a sort of politically liberal society that had sort of Christian religiosity as sort of the infused sort of source of spiritual meaning, sort of the ground for moral and political debates and so on. And for reasons more connected to social and technological change than to the thought of James Madison, that Christianity went into crisis in the 1960s and 70s. The sort of Protestant mainline that was sort of a sort of core institution of American life decayed and collapsed. And so since then, we've had sort of different religions and quasi-religions contending for the role of sort of the religious and spiritual center of our society. And you can see the Christian right of the 1990s and early 2000s as one attempt. We're going to ally evangelicals and Catholics and sort of fill the role the Protestant mainline played. That didn't work. Now woke progressivism is sort of a post-Protestant political theology is trying to play that role. But basically you're sort of waiting for a new sort of more capacious worldview to sort of infuse liberal structures. And so the problem in this argument would be not with liberalism per se, but with sort of spiritual, moral, religious currents within liberalism. I'm not 100% sure that I believe that, but that's I think at least a countervailing theory to the narrative that like this thing called classical liberalism tends inevitably towards secularism, materialism, and decay. The counter theory is no, like American Christianity was in good shape until we invented the TV, the interstate highway, and the birth control pill, and it hasn't recovered from those shocks, but at some point some religious force will come along to play that role. I don't know. That's a possible counter narrative to the critique of classical liberalism from the right.
I'll throw in just another possibility is it could be that we're learning that these principles we had, freedom, equality, and justice, we thought we knew what they were, and we are now discovering that we're not sure what those things are. Like, so we were talking about free, persuasion. Is that free speech, right? I think there's a real question there about what free speech is that we're trying to figure out. Like, and so you might think it's not necessarily that it needs to be like infused by something or other. It's that we thought we knew what our ideals were. We're learning that we didn't really know what they were, and so now we have the job of figuring it out.
Yeah, I mean, I think periods. I think sort of saying that free speech is an ideal that's where I sort of agree with the Daninian critique. Like, I think liberalism establishes a set of procedures. These procedures may be a good way to order a society, but if you treat the procedures as like the only highest good there is, then you're probably at a moment where you're missing something important in society, right? And so in that sense, like the woke reaction against free speech, while I disagree with the ideology that it wants to sort of instantiate, is correct that like you can't just run a society on free speech, right? You have to have some means of sort of settling certain normative disputes that society generates automatically, right? Like you can't just be, like, take something like same-sex marriage. Like, what is marriage, right? Like, society needs to have some idea of what marriage is because we have marriage laws that affect, and we have norms of how men and women or men and men are supposed to relate to each other and so on. You need some conception. And we used to have a Christian conception of what marriage is. And if you go back and like read the Supreme Court decisions against polygamy in the 19th century, they just sort of take for granted. Like, yeah, you know, we have a Judeo-Christian, biblical, whatever. They wouldn't have said Judeo-Christian, but a sort of this view of marriage. And, you know, Obergefell establishes a different, still arguably contested view of marriage. But if someone says, what is marriage? You can't, the answer can't just be, well, you know, we're a free society. Everyone defines marriage however they want. Because at some point, society has to make laws and norms surrounding that question. And so you need something besides just the sort of rules of negotiation to help answer it.
But you might just think everybody defining things how they want is not what free speech is. And the procedures that we think we have, we actually don't know what those procedures are. We
Well,
just
that-
don't
yes.
know.
No, that-
right?
that-
And so
that's
maybe you
debate.
can run a society just on free speech if you had the right conception of free speech, but we clearly don't have that. So that would just be the alternate possibility, is that we think we have this thing, oh sure, but there's this thing called free speech, but it's not all it's cut out to be. But it may just be like we literally don't know what we're talking about, and we reflexively reach for certain practices that have been in the past associated with that phrase, right? But now we have learned we don't know what the phrase means.
Yes, I'm going to say I don't think under any possible definition you can run a society on free speech alone.
Do you think you can run a marriage on free speech alone?
Let's take another question.
Okay.
Okay,
Hi.
hello. My name's Alyssa. I'm a fourth year, and I have a question relating to like one of the very first things that you all talked about, which was kind of like technology and innovation and like humanity and like a sense of self. And I know you said you're not like excellent at predicting the future, but I kind of am asking if basically with technology and innovation being able to like achieve things that humans used to do out of necessity, but also at this point, creativity and things like that, do you see a future where we have to almost dumb down that innovation or stifle it in order to maintain a sense of like self in humanity or purpose? I don't know if that makes sense, but.
It does, and I don't know. I'm going to be boring and say I don't know the answer. My general view is that the experience, I will just take the experience of art, right? We were talking about novels before, so let's use novels. I think that it is important to human beings as consumers of art and experiencers of art to have the sense that that art reflects the generative power of a consciousness. And that the idea that when you're reading a novel, you are reading a story that is told by a mind like yours, maybe a mind superior to yours, but still a mind in a way that is sort of familiar to you, that it's like a message from another consciousness to you. And if I'm right about that, then there will be some kind of limit on people's appetite for art generated by processes that seem completely different from our consciousness. But I could be wrong. It could be that, and this is quite possible, that people will simply impute consciousness to AI prematurely, right? They'll say, well, if the AI has written something that appears to be an excellent Harry Potter sequel, then that proves that it's just as conscious as J.K. Rowling, and therefore I will feel comfortable enjoying it. Like, that could happen, right? But I think you'd have to do, my suspicion is people will need to do something like that in order to really get into the kind of, whatever kind of art is generated by artificial intelligence in all its varied forms. Like with movies, right? Like, are people people love movie stars. They love celebrities. Even if now it's like, TikTok influencers or something instead of celebrities. The idea that there is some kind of real person who is embodying all the different roles is very important to people's experience of art. Is it possible for people to love, AI-generated characters in a movie just as much as they've loved Brad Pitt or Cary Grant? Maybe, but it would be a transformation, I think, in how people experience art. It wouldn't be as simple as, okay, now I watch movies with AI-generated actors. So it would have to be some change in the way that people are accustomed to experiencing art to get to the point where you could experience the fake people generated by the AI the way you currently experience actors in a movie.
And one piece of evidence for that is just that we already have access to really good reproductions of works of art, and yet people really want the original that has, in some sense, the spirit of that person behind it.
Slay.
Hey, my name's John. I'm a fourth year. My question is about, at the beginning you talked about paralysis, and I kind of wanted to get kind of an extension of that idea to exactly what you meant. My question is, do you think that this paralysis of the Western world has to do with a certain godlessness or moral relativism? And do you think that there could exist a non-decadent society that has kind of gone into a more like post-God philosophical dialogue?
I mean, as like a God believer, right? You don't want to sort of make everything about God, or maybe you do, but you want to be careful about that. I certainly think that there are plenty of forces besides religion that can generate meaning and purpose in people's lives. I think that's pretty clear. And some of the paralysis that I'm talking about, has to reflect, like, one example of sort of paralysis that's sort of, different from some of the things that, like, sort of affluent University of Chicago students might talk about is just the fact that, like, Americans move less than they used to. Like, working class Americans used to be more likely to leave a town and go to a new state to get a job or something. And now people move less. And that isn't, as far as we can tell, again, because they're sort of creating, Arcadian utopias of communal farms or something. It's because their lives seem, they're more likely to be on welfare programs, addicted to drugs. There's sort of like some kind of interaction between a loss of economic dynamism and a kind of social and cultural decay, right? That is a certain kind of paralysis. Now, is that caused by secularization? Is it driving secularization? There's some kind of, like, people in these communities are less likely to go to church than they used to be, but they're still quite unlikely to be atheists, right? Like, there's a lot of sort of secularization of working class America that's people just sort of drifting away from community and church going while retaining some kind of belief in God. So that would be an example of sort of stasis or stagnation, where you can't just say, oh, if only these people believed in God, they would go to a 12-step program, move to a new town for a job, and so on. No, it's clearly more complicated than that. With that being said, at the macro level, I think it's really tough to have a dynamic and optimistic and generative and creative society that doesn't have some conception that the world exists for a purpose and is infused with some kind of meaning and significance. I think that there is, the hardest sort of hard materialism. In the end, it's very hard to escape ending by denying basic human agency and free will, right? And I think it would be surprising if the denial of free will did not lead, in some sense, to a certain kind of stasis, uncreativity, and despair. And it would be, it would also be surprising, since God obviously does exist, and the universe very obviously does have meaning and purpose that is connected to our conscious minds, if a denial of that obvious, not to the point of a mathematical proof, but closer to that than many, many people in our society currently believe, if a denial of that obvious reality did not have follow-on consequences that were negative for the society. If you were cutting yourself off from some piece of reality as obvious as your conscious self exists and the universe exists for a reason, then you're probably cutting yourself off from a lot of other things as well.
I mean, one kind of experimental place to go with this is just, groups of people who believed in multiple gods who were not necessarily nice and weren't necessarily out for the good of human beings and didn't necessarily create us for a purpose. And there certainly have been such groups. And the idea of a single benevolent creator of everything, I agree, that's a very powerful, motivating and inspirational force, but it seems to me that certainly societies can get by with at least a variety of different kinds of cosmological pictures. Whether they can get by without one entirely, I agree, it's kind of is open.
Yeah. I mean, I think certainly you can have more pessimistic cosmological pictures than the biblical narrative, and have a society sort of shot through with human greatness and creativity. But I think it's hard when you reach the point of denying the existence of the human self itself. I think it's hard to do sort of the humanism of the ancient Greeks exists in a cosmology that has optimism in certain quarters, but it's not intensely optimistic. But it also exists in a cosmology where I don't want to overgeneralize. I don't want to wander too deep into theories of the classical world, so I'll trail off there instead.
Okay. Next question. Hi.
Hi. So I'm kind of interested in why tradition seems to be a lot of the times in the domain of conservatism. So going back to
Sorry, I missed the phrase. Tradition seems to be what?
in the domain of conservatism.
In the domain of, yes, got it.
Sorry. So just going back, you mentioned declining birth rates. And there's an idea and some evidence for it that in many countries, people are choosing to have fewer children because they feel like there's not that kind of strong community and familial support, and it takes a village to raise a child, and now they're having to do it alone. But on the flip side, that kind of traditional familial structure can also be constraining and heteronormative and kind of oppressive in that way. So for traditions like this, is there a place and a way to make them more freeing rather than constraining? And along the political spectrum, whose prerogative is that?
I mean, I don't think there's a single answer. I think it's going to vary with the particular tradition you're confronting and the particular social context you're in. I think in contemporary American society, we've reached a point where traditional strictures in most, not all, but most contexts are quite weak. And again, even relative to 25 or 30 years ago, right? And I mean, so in any situation, like this is if you're talking about sort of the balance between tradition and conservatism and liberalization and freedom and so on, like there isn't sort of one particular point of sort of perfect stability that you can preserve forever and ever, right? And like there's moments in time and societies in which any reasonable person should be a liberal, and there's moments in time and societies where any reasonable person should be a conservative. And so we can argue about which kind of society and which kind of moment we're in. But like if you took me with my particular set of views right now back in time to 1947 or 1980 or 1887, I would be a liberal in that context, right? So there's sort of, there's a certain relativism inherent in these categories of like, are you trying to loosen strictures or are you trying to reestablish norms? In terms of whose prerogative it is, I mean, in a sense, it's sort of all of our prerogative, right? I mean, the United States is a democratic society. It's a society where the government is supposed to be responsive to some degree to social change and to make policy with, not just in sort of terms of pure abstractions, but with some sense of like what's actually happening in American society. And so I think it's, the question of, I think that the question of how you create, in a landscape where you have too few customs or too few strictures, the question of how you create new customs or new strictures is a really hard one. And that's why, this is a particular problem for American conservatism, because American conservatism, more than other varieties, is sort of hostile to state power. So American conservatism is saying like, man, our society's really gone to hell, but the one thing we can't do is use state power to do anything about it. And not all conservatives say that, but that's sort of a default that a lot of conservatives have. But fundamentally, there's no certain answer, and for most people, you're making decisions in your own life, right? Like, I think in American society right now, like your choice right now is, you can start a family or not. You can have kids and raise them in a particular way or not. You can decide whether to join a church or not. And you are free to assume certain strictures or not. And in some sense, the future of customs and the future of strictures is going to be determined by what people your age and people younger than that decide. I think it's very unlikely that you're going to get a really strong sort of normative assertion using state power, like, of the kind that lots of liberals, I think, fear. Here I am making a prediction, but that would be my prediction for the next 50 years, that any sort of restoration of tradition or traditionalism will be sort of bottom up and voluntaristic long before it becomes sort of top down and governmentally directed. That was a very rambling quasi answer, and I'm sorry.
I would just add one thing, which is that
yes, help me out.
even like I have friends, lucky friends, who their parents like moved to be with them and to help them raise their kids. And that's great. I'm jealous of them. But they're still unbelievably stressed. And there's something about parenting. There's something that has happened over the past 50 years where it's like a ratchet of how much you're supposed to be pouring into your kid, protecting your kid, guiding your kid, et cetera, so that like the cost of parenting just keeps going up. And I'll give you just an example. Ross and I were talking as we were coming in, and I mentioned that my son was on a field trip, and he's like, where? And I'm like, Damn it, I don't know where. I should know, but I don't. I shouldn't. I was like really regretting that I mentioned
This is a great achievement.
the
But this
field
is a
trip.
great achievement. This is an achievement in relaxed parenting.
Right, but
that I
I'm
am
not
envious
relaxed
of.
enough to not feel guilty about I'm supposed to, what kind of mom am I that I don't know where my son is off at. And I feel like my mom would have just been much more comfortable being like, I don't know where she is. And her mom probably be even more comfortable. So I think that that's an additional independent thing that is, independently of whether you have a community and whether you have people helping you, yeah, that's great. But there has been this ratchet and this increased just amount of effort that you're supposed to put into each kid. And then of course you're gonna get fewer kids.
So as you mentioned earlier, you believe that there is a chance that AI technologies could lead our current decadent society farther into decadence. So as these AI technologies become more ubiquitous, how could we prevent this decline? And do you think there's any lessons from the past that we could learn from to help prevent this?
I mean, I think that societies are capable of regulating things they consider harmful that are sort of addictive and pleasurable. Like in my own lifetime, we have done this with cigarettes. Cigarettes are maybe not a great analog for an AI girlfriend, but there is a way in which I think that for some things related to, I wouldn't even say AI per se. I think it's best, I tend to think of it in terms of the virtual versus the real, because I don't believe in the bright virtual future. I think reality is essential and retaining connections to reality is essential. And so I think I think effectively a healthy society that has access to all kinds of immersive digital technologies that simulate reality in various addictive ways, whether they're AI-driven or not, has to start by protecting childhood and development from sort of premature immersion in that world. So in terms of, I guess this is a policy, right? So after my rambling talk about, the limits of policy and so on, when it comes, I think absolutely it should be public policy that childhood is as low tech as we can make it. And the Silicon Valley barons who send their kids to Waldorf schools while they, build smartphones to give to other people's kids, that should in fact be the model that all of society urges, or doesn't just urge, but effectively through the vastness of the public school system, through, sort of restrictions on use of digital media platforms enforce it. So that's sort of where I would start. Now, is that actually feasible in a world where, let's say, AI tutors, everyone wants their kid to have an AI tutor because they're obsessed with AI? I'm not sure. And maybe it is, maybe even that sort of starting point is just going to be overtaken by events and overtaken by the appeal of these technologies and the extent to which they will give people competitive advantages. But that's where I would start at the very least, with the attempted protection of childhood from the digital and the virtual, much more than we've done to date.
Okay.
Hi, I wanted to ask a little bit more about a point you made earlier where you kind of defined what you understood to be a traditional society, specifically when you made that connection to the Amish as maybe like an example of what maybe we should go back to. And so specifically you had mentioned like about their connection to nature still, and an idea of like sustainability, you had mentioned the word specifically. So with that idea of sustainability and a society that is better integrated with nature, like especially as climate change is such a huge issue now with technological innovation and industry innovation, do you not feel that maybe indigenous societies are a better model rather than the Amish to turn to for their way of living with the land?
I mean, I guess, I think these are going to be sweeping generalizations that are not, accurate in every case. The problem with the Amish, that wasn't a joke, but it wasn't like precise, right? The Amish actually use and interface with modern society in various ways. Even the Amish are not sort of set free from the development, the sort of world that surrounds them. Indigenous societies, whether they're indigenous to, North America in the 1600s or indigenous to Western Europe in 750 AD or something, right? Like, when we're talking about pre-modern societies, we're talking about societies that lived in harmony with nature through the mechanism of sort of Malthusian selection, right? Where, yes, their harmony was achieved in part by really high mortality rates when surplus populations exceeded the carrying capacity of the lands they were on. And it doesn't mean that they didn't also have other sort of secondary mechanisms of maintaining sustainability that we can learn from, and I think they did, and we can, and I think sort of generally the question of ecological sustainability is obviously an important one, though not completely distinct from the question of technological innovation, because innovation can create its own new mechanisms of sustainability. But what I meant when I said you can't sort of return to pre-modern pre-modern ways of life is that those ways of life were sort of integrally bound up in mortality rates that we would consider totally unacceptable for good reasons, right? So the question is, someone was asking me about this in the cookie break, right? Like, is it possible to have a society that is neither sort of in the Malthusian world, where you get effectively like mass die-offs, nor in our world of declining population, and where you are basically just sort of sustaining your population at a steady state, and people are having 2.1 children, and population grows pretty slowly and so on, but the age and dependency ratios stay even. Maybe that's possible, but that isn't the world we've ended up in, right? And the problem is we sort of escaped the Malthusian trap, and then we got really rapid population growth, and everyone freaked out about overpopulation, and now we're in sort of a population crash scenario. And I don't know how we get out of the population crash scenario, but the pre-modern model can't just be transplanted into this new world, I guess. So yes to specific practices, specific pre-modern practices. Can we learn from those? Absolutely. But the pre-modern model is not one that we would, I think, wish for ourselves.
Thank you. So I think the easy solution to like the population crash is to open the borders. You'll have way more Americans in like 20 years. And I think that like your objection, I've read some of your stuff on immigration, is that that sort of changes the culture of the country. But I think what's really great about Western culture is that it's actually very persuasive, that other countries actually move towards our culture, and that they are sort of convinced that if immigrants come here, they choose to come here, and they actually choose to take on a lot of the things that make Western culture great. So I think, why shouldn't we just open the borders, and why am I wrong?
Can I say something just quickly to that? And then, at best, it's a short-term solution, because if they become like us, their fertility will drop, right? So that's one. Might work for short term.
Yeah, no, I think that's that's one response, right? Which is that, and this cuts a little bit against my decadence of secular liberalism narrative, the fertility decline is general. It's happening in communist China, it's happening in Latin America, it is happening much more slowly, but is also happening in sub-Saharan Africa, right? So the question of how you escape from, like, I think you're right, there is sort of an assimilation to modernity that happens even in non-liberal societies. But to the extent that technological modernity yields low fertility rates very rapidly, then you aren't solving your long-term problem, right? And so you can see this actually with Canada. Canada is running the Canadian birth rate is going to be, I think, 1.3 next year or this year. They've had a real post-COVID fertility crash, and they're running a sort of turbocharged immigration experiment where immigration rates have gone way up under the Trudeau government. So they're doing your plan, but the immigrant fertility rates converge very quickly with Canadian fertility rates. So then you need even more immigrants, right? And then this yields the second point, which is, I mean, I think, yeah, immigration is going to happen, right? Absolutely. A lot of Africans are going to move to Europe. A lot of people from all over the world are going to move to the United States no matter what. I do not think that assimilation happens automatically and successfully in a context where immigration happens at certain scales and, at certain numbers. I think you need, for the assimilative process that you're describing to work independent of fertility questions, just in terms of like people getting along and having a functioning democracy, you need some sense that like the pace of change is not so crazy that your society is just turning over completely culturally every 25 or 30 years. So that is at the very least a case for trying to manage migration flows to some degree beyond simply doing open borders. Like, I do not think that if every person in sub-Saharan Africa moved to Italy, Germany, and France tomorrow, that there would not be some like tremendous social and political problems. And in fact, I think a challenge for liberals, right, is that, the backlash, I mean, clearly certain forms of right-wing backlash that liberals oppose are themselves generated by liberal immigration policies, right? And if you are a liberal who favors open borders, you at least have to build in the possibility of backlash into your plans. You can't be like, open borders will be great if actually the end point of open borders is, Marine Le Pen becomes president of France. You have to have like how do we avoid or Donald Trump becomes president of the United States. You have to build into your plan for open borders some mechanism for dealing with the Trump-Le Pen possibility, which I don't think simple open borders or good politics does.
Hi.
Hi.
You mentioned that people voluntarily not having kids is depressing, but I'd like to know how that is depressing when most of the newer generation does not see the benefit in kids. A lot of them don't see kids fitting into the lifestyle that they want for themselves. Also, do you believe men would be right to have a strong opinion on fertility when they're not the ones giving birth?
Obviously, the answer to the last question is yes, because I'm sitting here offering you lots of strong opinions on fertility, despite the fact that I did not give birth to any of my children. I think that human societies function best when men and women understand themselves to be in some kind of partnership, and in that sense, just acting as if sort of reproduction is a kind of female issue and female responsibility one way or another, and men should be indifferent to it, doesn't actually comport with how, human beings have ever lived or necessarily want to live. Men have the desire to have progeny, or they don't, but regardless, any system that sort of respects people's desires and preferences has to, at the very least, take a male desire for progeny into account and not just say, well, you know, you don't have a womb, too bad, you don't get a vote. I don't think that makes sense. But to your first question, there's sort of separate issues. One issue is that there's sort of a basic knowledge problem that people don't have about what having kids is like until they have kids, that unfortunately cannot be conveyed to you by simply like showing you pictures of babies or something like that, right? Like there is a good to having kids that is, for most people, only experienced when the kids are your own kids, right? And so I think one of the challenges is that a society that encourages people to postpone childbearing and child rearing and sort of encourages the idea that it's just sort of, just not a really important good, but just sort of one good among many, is going to generate a lot of people who, don't have a strong preference for having kids because they've never had kids of their own and don't actually know what it's like and just see the, what Agnes was talking about, the incredibly burdensome aspects of it, which are incredibly burdensome, I can assure you, but are compensated for in ways that are for lots and lots of people, not everybody, but lots and lots of people, really conducive to, I think, the deepest forms of human flourishing. And I think that's especially true over the life cycle, that like how you feel about having kids at age 27 is just going to be really different from how you feel about not having kids at age 72. And a well-functioning society has an obligation to, not run some kind of, eugenicist forced breeding program or something, but to convey to people through societal norms constructed in some mysterious way that, in fact, you should be aware of what your 72-year-old self will feel like when you're deciding whether to mate and marry and have kids 40 or 50 years before that.
Just to add one thing, I think that, in the past, people didn't do as much choosing about whether or not they would have kids, right? And we do more choosing now. And I think that really is a different situation that we're in. And it may well be that, I take it this is what the question was sort of challenging us, maybe we just haven't actually made the case very well. It's not just that we need norms, because that just sort of sounds like we need to bully people into something, but we actually do need to explain what's so great about having kids, why should you have kids. If we could explain that to people, they'd want to have kids because they'd see that it was great. And I guess I think, I'm not so convinced by the argument, well, you can't know what it's like until you have the kids, because that's sort of true of every big thing that you ever might do in your life. It's true about going to college. It's true about things where we do manage to convey to people why you should do it, even though it's going to be really different. And so it may be that we're living at a new time when the argumentative demands are higher, and we just haven't risen to the occasion yet. And so, people are coming to us being like, hey, you haven't made the case. Maybe that's just because we actually haven't made the case.
Yeah, I think that's fair up to a point, although I do think there's a distinction, right? Let's suppose, people go through puberty, and before they go through puberty, they don't normally have a really strong desire for the opposite sex, and after they go through puberty, they do, right? It's maybe a fair generalization. And it would be tough if you were like, well, you're going to I don't mean to get into debates about transgender issues or puberty blockers or anything like that. But for the sake of the thought experiment, imagine if people chose whether to go through puberty or not, and you were going to go to a 10-year-old and be like, hey, you should really go through puberty because then you'll get to fall in love and have sex. And any healthy, decent, sane 10-year-old would be like, that's gross. Let's not do that, right? And there is a way, it's not exactly the same thing, but there is a way in which the vindication of having what you get out of having a child is a it's not just sort of a personal, it's a psychological and stronger for the woman than the man, but for both, a biological transformation that can be described. My wife wrote a book about like the science of the maternal transformation that did a lot of describing. But part of what I took from that book was, that like the maternal instinct in women is created by having a child. Like, yeah, there's some desire to have children, and some people have more of it than others, and some people feel like their biological clock is ticking and so on. But like the core instinct, the desire to like protect and defend and love your child is generated by childbearing and child rearing. And so it is, I mean, I write a lot of things about why it's good to have kids, and I've made a lot of different cases for it in a lot of different venues, hopefully sometimes more eloquently than what I've said tonight. But I do think there is a challenge of experience that does complicate those efforts, that it's hard to convey fully what you're getting out of it before you do it.
I think it's a really interesting thought experiment. And I think that it really matters that like kids are kids and their parents get to decide things for them. But by the time you're deciding whether or not to have a kid, you're an adult. And so people don't get to decide things for you.
Yes.
And so that really is, to me, like a very different situation. And so, yeah, we're stuck having to make arguments, I think.
Persuade, if you will.
Well, we can disagree to disagree about that. We can take only one more question, I'm afraid, because we have to stop at 11:30. So you are the last question.
Hi, I'm Vera, a second year in the college. My question is, if you want a more optimistic outlook on the world than the one discussed at the beginning of this session, what institutions would you turn to? And if it's more traditional ones, religious ones, how do you reckon with the abuse and scandal in the church?
Well, I think part of the problem is we don't have sort of currently particularly successful and credible institutions, not just religious institutions, I think, that people can turn to and feel sort of trust in to guide and shape their perspectives on the world. And this, too, is not, it's not just a function of sort of ideas, it's a function of social and technological change that, has had positive effects. It's helped expose abuses, including the sex abuse crisis that, would have been harder to expose in prior eras when presumably there was plenty of sexual abuse. But it's also made it harder for people, like people see, there's a guy named Martin Gurry who wrote a book called The Revolt of the Public that is about the effect that the internet has had on all institutions. And it's like just the degree of exposure that institutions and their leaders now have, so much about the foibles and flaws and inner workings of government and universities and religious institutions and so on that, yeah, I think establishing a baseline of trust is really challenging in any context, I think, not just a religious context. With that being said, I think the way you personally, most people now, again, to the question about where are we as a society, right? I think we as a society, we are sufficiently deinstitutionalized and post-institutional that the dangers of submission are just less significant than they were in 1955 or something. Like the Catholic Church, to which I belong, is a huge mess, right? It's everybody's fighting with everybody else. Nobody has any confidence in the bishops, no matter what kind of authority they claim. And that's unfortunate, but it also means that as a Catholic, you can worry a little bit less that if you go to Mass every Sunday, you're gonna be imprisoned in some sort of punitive culture. I think it's easier now to say, okay, I think there's a God. I want to be in touch with that God. I was raised Catholic. I can go to Mass on Sundays and have a connection and a deepening of my relationship to the author of the universe. And I can do that and, do that as my own choice and not worry that I'm like a prisoner of scary nuns, and I'm only going to mass because I'm afraid of them whacking me on the wrist with a ruler, right? Like the disappearance and collapse of authority creates big problems for society. But for you as an individual, it creates an opportunity to participate in institutions that are somewhat disenchanted, but that are therefore less dangerous to your individuality and self. Like if you go to, say you started going to a Latin Mass Catholic parish tomorrow, right? And you did it for a year and a half, and the community you realized was like just super judgmental and like just the worst. You went in the confessional and the priest was like, "You're terrible," and he was sexist. It was just like any cliche you have about, the dark side of religion. Nothing's keeping you in that parish. This is America in 2023. You can get up and go down the road, and there's going to be a liberal Catholic parish that's like, peace and love and rainbows. And then you're going to realize that that's too much peace and love and rainbows, and you're going to go somewhere else. Like, again, these create problems for society that people are not bound to institutions and shaped by them. But I don't think they create huge problems for you trying to decide, like, can I be religious without feeling like I'm living in The Handmaid's Tale? Yes, you can be, and you should.
Let me add something, which is I think a problem that I think does. So I agree that we're not like trapped as much in institutions as we used to be. But the problem that you're raising, which is like, where can I find optimism, is a real problem. And you can. I think it's like you have to kind of be on the hunt for it. And you might find it in a religious institution. Even if you do find it in a religious institution, you're probably going to need more optimism than that in your life, right? And so I think you have to just like always have like a kind of optimism radar or something out where you're like, is this a place where people believe in something? And you'll find it like in unexpected places. Like I write for this magazine called The Point. Here, I have their tote bag as it happens.
A fine publication.
A fine publication, but also like, when I started to write for them, I immediately had this feeling of this is a group of people that believes in something. And so you can walk into a class. I'm sure this has happened to all of you. Walk into a classroom, and some classrooms, okay, fine, this is interesting. And some classrooms, this is a place where somebody believes in something. And the thing just lights up, right? And so I think, it may be that religion is sort of designed or supposed to provide this for us, and it does provide it for some of us to some degree, but I also think that the kind of loosening of authority means you actually have to hunt for it more. Okay, thank you guys so much. Thank you so much, Ross.
Thank you.
Thank you also to Tyler and the forum. I'm very sorry to those of you whose questions we didn't get to. Come to the next Night Owls, which is Chris Arnaud and I are going to talk about travel on November 2nd. And good night.